minions, welcome to Crank It Up. This is the Postmortem for Game 24, featuring Disco Dancing Dinosaurs versus Giant Ant Pirates. I had Disco Dancing Dinosaurs winning this matchup, but unfortunately they did not. Giant Ants will be advancing to round 3, having won both games and not even requiring a game 3. They did it this time by not actually going infinite. Last time in round 1, they went infinite in both cases, but they didn't need it this time. And I think it's good that Giant Ants don't go infinite every game, that they could win just the normal way by having enough counters out to just persist first mates, break a couple of bases, gain a points advantage, and then go from there. I don't want to keep saying infinite, infinite, infinite. But the potential still exists, and they're going to have Killer Plant Truckers in round 3, which is going to be really fascinating. You've got two very endgame-oriented teams that have backup plans. You've got the infinite first mates versus the persistent overgrowth. It's going to be fascinating to see who will pull off their endgame first. But let's talk about Disco Dancing Dinosaurs. Now, the difference between Steampunk Incas and Disco Dinosaurs is that Disco Dinosaurs have destruction. Steampunk Incas had no way of affecting the Giant Ant Pirates at all. They could be very fast, but if they weren't fast enough, then Giant Ant Pirates would be able to do the thing, and that's exactly what happened both games. So Disco Dinosaurs have two forms of destruction. They have the Laser Tops, which can destroy a minion of power 2 or less. Now, that's unlikely to take out a first mate. The first mate would probably be out until it's buffed. But it could take out a soldier, and it could take out a worker. And that's important because every counter matters. If you can remove counters off the board, those are counters that can't be transferred. They also have action-based destruction, and though they don't have a lot, it does bode well because of the fact that the Disco Dancers can copy the action destruction. You have natural selection. Natural selection will copy it onto anyone. Even though the original target has to be lower, the copied target doesn't have to be. So you can destroy two minions at the same time. And the same thing can happen with survival of the fittest. Because Giant Ant Pirates would want to spread out and not actually help Disco Dancing Dinosaurs by breaking bases, survival of the fittest can take out multiple ones at the same time. They'd have to play around it, but if you could have a way of copying that as well, you could potentially take out 3 or 4 minions. And that may be just enough destruction to slow them down. It didn't work out that way. But as I mentioned in my third update video, there are certain homework assignments that we need to do to make sure that a situation doesn't come up during the game that we don't know how to answer that could greatly impact the game. And in the days leading up to these matchups, we actually did come across something that had to be researched very carefully because it was yet another way that the Disco Dancing Dinosaurs could thwart the Giant Ant Pirates, and it would be doing so in an incredibly potent and surprising way. And that way is I Will Survive and Dancing King. Now, before I get to the actual rules and what we decided on, let's talk about the situation. Dancing King can copy any action onto a minion on the same base as the action is being played. I Will Survive is mandatory to return a minion to the discard pile. If Dancing King is copying it, then it's going to return another minion to the hand instead of the discard pile. Instead of the discard pile being the key phrase, and I hate that phrase. So the scenario came up, and I'm thinking, what if a first mate with a ton of power counters, let's say 28 power, he's been boosted heavily, he's on Dancing King's base. When that base scores, can Dancing King play I Will Survive to return himself and the first mate in time to stop the first mate from moving from base to base? We thought heavily about it. Disco Dancing is one of the worst written faction from a rules perspective because it is so confusing and the clarifications do not make things any easier. There are clarifications that are there that don't make any sense. And I don't even know how some of the things that they talk about are possible. It just seems like they were writing things for the sake of writing things. But it basically came down to a couple of options, and it was a question of which option was first, which option was correct. The first option was that player order matters, that the person that the removal from I Will Survive and the removal from the first mate, because they both have, instead of the discard pile, that turn order mattered. Whichever one happened first would be the one that actually took place. And the thinking was that instead of the discard pile literally means instead of the discard pile. And that if you don't go to the discard pile, then the second instead of the discard pile doesn't matter because it's no longer avoiding the discard pile. Therefore, if you can't avoid it, you can't do the thing that essentially avoids it. What that meant was, if it was Disco's turn, that it would work because they would choose the order. They would choose I Will Survive to happen before the first mate because both of them are deferred. They, instead of the discard pile, technically moves it until the time when the cards are discarded, and it doesn't actually happen yet. It's triggered to happen, but doesn't happen yet. The second way of interpreting it, and just to follow up on that thought, the opposite was that if it were the Giant Ant Pirate's turn, then they would pick the first mate to happen, they'd avoid the discard pile, and then I Will Survive would just fizzle because it's no longer avoiding the discard pile. The second interpretation was that order didn't matter, that both of them would actually happen, and that no matter which order happened, it would end in the same result. That the first mate would move, and then I Will Survive would return it, or if I Will Survive happened first, I Will Survive would return it, and then the first mate would have no means of moving, and therefore would be moot. After researching it heavily and running it by some other people, we decided that the first option was correct. And we believe very strongly that it is correct. That turn order matters, that they happen at the same time, and that whoever turn it was would choose the option that favored them best. And if it happened to Giant Ant Pirates in their turn, that they would be able to circumvent I Will Survive. And this scenario actually came into play during Game 2. According to Chucky, if it had happened on his turn, it was not a guarantee the Giant Ant Pirates were going to win, and it was completely plausible that that would have slowed them down enough that they had an outside chance of winning the matchup. And it would have been great if they had, because I had them winning and advancing to round 3. But it happened on the Giant Ant player's turn, which is why it wasn't a factor. But it's incredible to think that, that could potentially stop an infinite from happening on the next turn. If you have a ton of counters on the first mate, and you know that he's going to survive, you're losing badly, but on your next turn, you're going to play We Will Rock You once or twice and just, blow the game open. If he's all of a sudden returned out of nowhere, that would greatly impact you. It's sad that it didn't work out that way. I think, like I said before, I think it's good that Giant Ant Pirates showed that they could win despite not having their maximum output. Even if you don't have... I play pirate games a lot. And rarely ever do I play Giant Ant Pirates or Mad Scientist Pirates. I usually prefer to do just some straight buffing of them, whether it's heirlooms or cyborg apes, or even just a more moderate power counter faction. They could win just by keeping first mates in long enough and consistently having a head start on bases. And I think, like I said, I'm happy that they won without doing the thing. With Killer Clan Truckers, that is going to be incredibly important, because when you think about it, Overgrowth could potentially be moving every turn, but so would the first mates and all their counters. Killer Clan Truckers, they have some interesting ways of counteracting giant ants, but I'm not going to talk about that during this video. But you have a very interesting question that we'll be facing in round 3. Will the first mates follow Overgrowth enough in order to counteract overgrowth? Can you potentially lose the overgrowth base due to the first mates and still have the first mates be out in play? Very fascinating stuff. Really interesting pairing. I'm excited to see who will win. I had Disco Dancing Dinosaurs winning that matchup, but obviously they're eliminated, so that's not going to happen. I'm going to be wrong either way, but excited to see what will unfold. That's it for all of round 2. We'll see you tomorrow for game 25, which is Itty Critter Grims versus Lucha Egyptians, my Dark Horse candidate. I'll see you tomorrow. Let's shut it down.